Morning everyone, Dr. Eric here, your fitness physician and peptide doc. I'm going to continue on talking about peptides. I did a short talk the other day introducing peptides in general, and we're explaining what they were. I'm going to start talking about some of the individual peptides and processes related to them. So today we're going to talk about the growth hormones enhancing and secreting peptides. These are the ones that enhance your body's own natural production of growth hormone. However, as we're finding out, that it does more than that. There are receptors throughout your body for these peptides that have their own functions and effects in a beneficial way outside of just simply increasing your growth hormone, and we'll talk about that more later. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the aging process. Just to touch on it, there's a lot to it, but as we found with aging, it comes down to inflammation and an increased oxidative state and mitochondrial dysfunction. Under these categories, with basically the electrons that get transferred from molecule to molecule and cell to cell, they get reduced and oxidized, meaning there's a flow of electrons, there's a flow of energy. That's what drives everything. We call it a reduction in oxidation. Oxygen or electrons go from one molecule to another. When it gets out of control and there's too much of one versus the other, it gets out of balance and it can cause damage. You hear about a lot about reduced reactive oxygen species or free radicals. These are things when there are too many of these, or the system gets out of control. Think of normally you're juggling a bunch of balls or BBs around with. If there's too many of these flying around, some extra BBs flying around, say you're outside your house, you're playing with these, some extra BBs get thrown off more than what you can catch. They're going to hit a wall, they're going to hit some siding, it's going to create a hole, it's going to cause some damage. So we want to control that process. So when it gets out of control, that's one of the things that can cause aging. We're all about improving the aging process, improving our health span and our lifespan, and we want to slow that down. So there's ways to do that by controlling these redox reactions, controlling the excessive reactive oxygen species and free radicals, controlling inflammation, and definitely improving mitochondrial function. With aging itself, we're finding out, of course, we know that a lot of hormones and chemical processes get slowed down and decreased. Testosterone, estrogen, many others, but certainly in this context of this conversation, growth hormone and IGF-1 get decreased as well. What we're finding is that there's an increase of cellular cortisol. We all hear about cortisol. It's good or bad depending on the context of the situation. We need it acutely, but chronically, elevations or decreases can be a bad thing. But inside the cell, our cells make cortisol. They convert cortisone into cortisol inside the cell. This has nothing to do with the systemic process of cortisol that you all hear about from your adrenal glands, and people talk about adrenal fatigue and things like that. So with aging, you can get an increased level of this intracellular cortisol, which can be mitigated by these peptides, and we'll talk about this shortly. With aging as well, we have the concern about sarcopenia, loss of muscle mass, which of course predisposes to falls and injuries and inflammation. There's decreased insulin sensitivity, there's mitochondrial dysfunction, there's decreased cognition and memory, decreased immune function, decreased mitochondrial biogenesis and efficiency, and because of that decreased efficiency, meaning the mitochondria aren't working properly, you get those increases of reactive oxygen species and free radicals, and everything starts to slow down. The mitochondrial theory of aging is just that the mitochondria start wearing out, they stop making new ones, they stop working less efficiently, and it affects everything because the mitochondria power everything. They're the powerhouses of the cells. Again, we talked about decreased overall sex steroid and other steroid production. Again, a lot of that comes from the mitochondria. There's an increased catabolic state of the aging process, as we talked about, the decreased immune function, sarcopenia, loss of energy, loss of sleep, depression, decreased nutrient acquisition or absorption because you can't absorb the nutrients, sedentary lifestyle and diet, nutrition, lack of exercise, they all contribute to this. But some of this is brought on by some of these things. Like as we get older, a lot of people lose their appetite, they can't absorb the nutrients, so it causes more problems, causes them to slow down. They don't want to work out, man. They don't want to eat the right foods because they just can't do it. So all these things contribute to the aging process. In terms of mitochondrial dysfunction, again, this is a whole conversation in itself, but there's a decrease in the number and quality of mitochondria as we age. There's a decrease in the biogenesis, in other words, making of new healthy mitochondria. There's a loss of enzymes and protein molecules. There's a lot that create those energy processes. As we mentioned earlier, there's a decrease in sex steroid and other steroid productions. Because of that, there's a decreased production of certain proteins, like those proteins related to growth and immune function. They're pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines and molecules that are made, and that balance can get skewed. There's decreased apoptosis, or the clearing and destruction of the damaged or worn out cells. So this can increase the senescent state, which is something we don't want. Senescent cells are ones that are just not working properly. They're just kind of sitting there, causing problems. They start secreting these inflammatory markers, and then that affects other molecules, and it causes a bad downstream effect like dominoes. Also with the aging process, there's decreased stem cell production. Stem cells, of course, are what we need to produce new viable cells and new tissues. So all this is going to come into play, and it makes sense when I talk about the beneficial effects of these peptides, because it can reverse all these things, or many of these things. So we're going to talk about some of these peptides. So with growth hormone and IGF, growth hormone gets secreted in your hypothalamus up in your brain. It contributes and makes your pituitary gland basically secretes the actual growth hormone. The initial signal comes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, gets carried down, and your liver creates a molecule called IGF-1. The growth hormone is bound to the IGF-1 to make it last longer, and that's where it gets all these effects. So maybe I'll do some visuals down the road, but it can basically upregulate some processes like oxidative phosphorylation, which is the electron transport chain inside the mitochondria that produce energy. The beta oxidation of fats and other nutrients to provide energy, basically breaking down your food to provide energy. It makes these processes work better. It's going to upregulate certain enzymes and chemicals and proteins that can benefit mitochondrial function and create new mitochondria, things like PGC1 alpha, PPAR gamma. These peptides can improve satellite cell activation and improve satellite cell and stem cell function. So basically these young growing cells can improve their function and stimulate them to produce more tissue to help you with the healing process, to recover, help your skin, your bones, your muscles heal faster. And these peptides are going to decrease that intracellular cortisol production, which I mentioned earlier, which of course is going to lower inflammation and improve cell function. It's going to also help with the apoptosis process, and it's going to benefit this. So we're going to clear out the bad cells and make the other cells work better. So that's the whole point, making the cells and the mitochondria work better. That's how one of the hugest things that these peptides do. So some of the GHRHs, the growth hormone releasing hormones, basically as I mentioned, they're stored in the hypothalamus, and they're released, and they attach to the receptor in the pituitary gland, and it causes an increase in circulating growth hormone in a natural fashion, in following the normal circadian rhythm. With exogenous growth hormone, it does this artificially, and there are some negatives to that, and I'll make a little chart of that later. But basically, it's the growth hormone gets secreted in a natural fashion. Most of it, which of course is made in the evening. You get some pulses during the day, but most of it occurs at night. So we're enhancing that natural circadian production so it follows a natural rhythm. So therefore you get the benefits, and there's no negative effects of this. As I mentioned, IGF binds the growth hormone to circulate throughout the body, and basically the bottom line is these peptides and IGF, growth hormone, it has to do with the regulation of, it has to do with cell proliferation, differentiation, maturation, and all multiple tissues throughout the body, the bone, the cartilage, the muscle tissue, the brain, everywhere. So there's these IGF receptors throughout the body, but there's also receptors for growth hormone releasing hormone throughout the body too, multiple body parts, and it's also causing some beneficial effects. What we call is the growth hormone releasing hormone is what we call pleiotropic. It has multiple effects. So it also not only affects these receptors throughout the body in a positive way, but it entrains them or teaches them to be more receptive to the growth hormone and IGF when it does come through the system. Again, making it work better, more efficient. Our body is really smart. It's really cool how it does this. So basically, these peptides are, as I mentioned, proliferation, cellular healing, tissue growth, tissue repair, and it has to do with the reparative functions of this. There's also a decrease in inflammatory cytokines like IL-2, interleukin-2, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and things. And there's a beneficial effect on anti-inflammatory cytokines. Again, with growth hormone versus peptides, again, I'll try to create a little chart for this, but basically it's a natural production and release of growth hormone, so therefore you don't get kind of what we call tachyphylaxis. In other words, the effects don't wear off over time. There's minimal to no side effects. It's readily available, supports healthy pituitary function, whereas with the growth hormone itself, it can affect the pituitary function since they're stimulating it artificially. So that's it for this video. I'm going to continue on with growth hormone in the next video, and we will talk to you guys soon.